listening to PodCatalyst, the official podcast of IABC, where communicators from around the world tell their stories. Let's get started with today's episode. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kristen Frankevich, IABC content manager and podcast producer. Today, I'm passing the mic to Kamyar Naficy, chair of the IABC International Executive Board, who sits down with Jessamyn Katz, CEO of Heyman Associates. They'll each introduce themselves in their own words in just a moment. Heyman Associates is a leading executive search firm focused exclusively on communications, corporate affairs, marketing, and investor relations, so certainly a large overlap within our IABC community. Jessamyn has been with the company for nearly 2 decades, and she's led the firm's strategy and day-to-day operations since 2019. In January of this year, she stepped into the role of CEO. I really enjoyed being able to sit in on this conversation and learn more. Jessamyn touches on the trends she's seeing in national and global executive searches, managing communications through political cycles, skills gaps in the field, the emergence of comms plus roles, and so much more. A big thanks to Jessamyn and Kamyar for taking the time to have this conversation, and I hope you enjoy today's episode.
Hi, my name is Jessamyn Katz. I'm CEO of Heyman Associates, and I think communication creates opportunities to connect with whatever audience is most important to your organization to make a difference.
Hi, my name is Kamyar Naficy. I'm chair of the International Executive Board of IABC and managing director of Albrin Strategic Communications. And I think communications done well creates impact. Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of IABC PodCatalyst. I'm Kamyar Naficy, your host for today's episode, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our guest, Jessamyn Katz, CEO of Heyman Associates. Welcome to the show, Jessamyn. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be chatting with you.
That's wonderful. And Jessamyn, I know that at the start of this year, you were appointed CEO of Heyman Associates, which I think many people would regard as the preeminent specialist executive search firm for communications. What was it like transitioning into that role? And what are some of the highlights of your year so far?
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really exciting year for us, the firm, and for me with our first leadership transition in the firm's history. And I've been at the firm for nearly 20 years and was humbled and honored to take over for Bill, our founder, in January. So for me, it's been a really exciting sort of and somewhat natural transition, I would say, to evolve my expertise with what I've been doing with clients and in the market day to day. And, not only continue that, but also think about how we're going to shape the firm for the future and think ahead within the function that we specialize in and those adjacent functions in public and government affairs and investor relations and marketing, and how communications is still central to this evolving function and stakeholder landscape.
That's really interesting, Jessamyn. I know we talk a lot in communications about succession planning amongst other issues. So it sounds like the transition at Heyman from Bill's time to yours, given you had this long evolution of the firm, has been very successful. And it's we're really happy to have you here to have a conversation about what you're seeing from your vantage point in the comms industry. Clearly the industry has evolved significantly in the last decade, even just the last few years. And from your vantage point, from your perspective, both leading the firm at Heyman Associates, but also leading major national and global searches, what are the key trends you're seeing?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a, wonky year, I think, and it's not lost on me that we're talking the day after Election Day. So I think we've seen a bit of a shift in the focus of communications this year from one of promote to protect. I think it's always been the job to strike a balance between the two, but I think this year we've seen a little bit more emphasis on the protect part of the equation. I think AI has certainly dominated a lot of the conversation in the function, And I think we're starting to see the function move from sort of an experimentation phase to an implementation phase. And, I think that no surprise, communications is still deeply involved in managing political cycles of the election and trying to plan ahead, but also react to what's in front of them, not only in this country, but around the world in sort of an increasingly heightened emotional and political landscape.
And Jessamyn, you talked about the kind of move and emphasis from promoting brands to protecting brands. You talked a bit about how that's, obviously a function of the increasingly, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world we live in. Do you think it's also partly a function of, your vantage point, obviously handling very senior CCO roles that I guess by definition are larger companies, maybe not always. Do you see that? Do you have a sense of that at sort of smaller and medium-sized companies or, for example, startups and tech startups? I know you're based in San Francisco. Because the sense I get is that with those kind of companies, there's a little bit less of a focus on brand protection. They're obviously not under huge scrutiny yet, and they're not highly visible. There's a big focus on brand promotion to drive sales and growth. What do you see in that space? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that there's no one size fits all communications function or strategy or approach. So I think you always have to start with where is the business and where are we trying to go and take it from there. So, certainly I think a smaller company very much in growth mode is focused on growth, is able sometimes to sort of try new things while they're a little bit more, under the radar. But I do think even in startups and within the tech industry, there's been sort of a wake up and catch up to some of the fundamentals of behaving like a grown-up, mature company before that day comes. So I think we see, even in smaller size or earlier stage companies, an interest in planning for that eventuality. Every startup growth company has typically aspirations to be a big, successful public company. And so I think we do hear, and our clients within that sort of category are still looking for both. We want business mature and the person who can help us get to the next stage, but we want someone who's also innovative and creative and can try new things and help us grow in the category we're in.
And you also talked a little bit about the importance of being able to manage communications through political cycles, obviously very timely given where we are with the elections here in the US, but there's also been 60 plus elections globally this year. Can you tell us a bit more about what's on the radar of CCOs, both in their day-to-day job, but also when developing their careers or when they're in the recruitment process with regard to that? What are the kind of key points?
Yeah, I think there are many dimensions of the definition of global experience and international experience. And I think, unfortunately in the US, we're probably, often talking about the global mindset, and yet fewer communications and corporate affairs leaders within the US market have probably had the opportunity to be operating on the ground in other places. So I think certainly as one develops their career and has aspirations to sort of lead the function in a truly global enterprise, seeking the opportunity to really be in the field, in a business, in a region elsewhere will certainly make you a standout in terms of your candidate profile. And I think it's an increasing sort of necessary reality of the experience one should have to kind of navigate a global ecosystem. But I think it's also the reality that nobody and no one person can be equal expert on all parts of the world. And so I think about sort of a back to basics leadership style of, know your strengths and make sure you're building a team and resources around you to complement those strengths, and don't assume that you are an expert in parts of the world or parts of the function where you have no experience.
That's an interesting segue, I think, to just thinking about some of the global macro issues to some of the topics around ESG, sustainability, purpose, which of course have been kind of very much on the radar of CCOs in recent years. And I saw some really interesting research that Heyman Associates had done that have found that the number of job descriptions that mention, I think, ESG and sustainability had increased massively since 2016. I think it was sort of 1,600%, according to the research that you guys did. But at the same time, we're seeing other research. There was a piece of research by FactSet earlier this year that showed that we have the lowest number of S&P 500 companies citing ESG on their earnings calls in the last few years. So I'm just wondering what that disconnect is. I wonder if it's to do with the different audiences. Obviously, earnings calls are targeted at analysts and the wider investment community, and we know they've slightly cooled on ESG for various reasons recently, whereas there's obviously other audiences of note, employees, customers who may well still care about some of those topics. But can you tell us a bit more about the kind of ESG and sustainability piece that you guys found?
Yeah, and I think this is something to sort of watch. Obviously, some of what we measured is up to this point, that sort of growth. And I think what we're hearing and seeing from clients is also sort of a distinction between the experience people are seeking or the scope of responsibility someone has, which may not be the same as how an organization is talking about their commitments or activity. So I'm not sure that I have the expertise to point to a correlation there. I think what, for us, it sort of underpins is this expanding nature of the function. And I alluded to the breadth of our capabilities now. And I think we've been seeing, and this research we did, and I think the focus on ESG and some other adjacent functions sort of points to the communications plus remit and the need for broader experience and thinking as well.
That's really interesting. You mentioned the communications plus kind of broadening remit of comms roles. I mean, you talked a bit about the growth or the evolution of the profession, but how do you see that reflected in the hiring trends? I mean, clearly communications plus is one, but can you tell us more about that and some of the other hiring trends that are coming out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that titles don't mean everything, but I think the obvious one is you see the sort of move to the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer title, which is typically a role that is inclusive of communications, public and government affairs, ESG in some cases, philanthropy in some cases. I mean, it can be defined in a lot of different ways, but I think it's the brass tacks reaction to this communications plus mandate and companies trying to answer the fact that communications is one of few functions at a company that is typically kind of working cross-functionally and has kind of increasing value and influence, if not ownership, over some of those adjacent functions, and thinking about how can we sort of in an ever increasingly complex stakeholder landscape figure out how to tell stories in a more connected way to all of our audiences.
And that emergence of the comms plus roles, I think that's really encouraging and actually an exciting development. It obviously signals that the role is becoming more elevated in the C-suite and it's becoming broader, more strategic. As you were saying, it's kind of very much focused on kind of managing complex and multiple stakeholder interests. But in some cases, I do kind of hear anecdotally, maybe in a minority of cases, and maybe it's a cynical view, but maybe in some cases it could be a way of cutting costs in some contexts, which I think maybe you hear given the wider economic context. I mean, do you feel that's fair, or what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think there's always sort of there are seasons for organizational design, and cost is always a factor in rethinking structure and whatnot. But to be honest, where we sit and where we see the value, I would say the flip side of that is these roles command larger compensation. As a result, the teams are bigger. So I don't think it's as clear I don't think you can draw a clear line to it being cost cutting. I would draw the line more to increase value.
And in terms of that sort of value that CCOs and senior comms professionals are sort of bringing to the table, you've talked about some of the skills, the evolving skills. To what extent do you think there's a skills gap? I mean, what can be done to address that? And can you talk a bit more about what are the key skills that are needed now and how that's evolving?
Yeah, I think there are some really important kind of evergreen skills that, we still hear from senior leaders and CEOs, even in their senior most hires and key deputies within this function. that they struggle to find. I think writing chief among them. We hear all the time that, yes, we want a broad thinker, a global mindset, business person first. But at the end of the day, this is still a writing intensive profession. And I think some of that gets underplayed at the senior levels. I would say rising value and importance for employee communications and I think the rise of the employee base as such a critical audience strategically and culturally. And then I would say crisis and reputation management is another evergreen probably experience set that goes a little bit in and out of fashion depending on perhaps the climate. And so I think one of the things, obviously, with the emergence of sort of the comms plus role or chief corporate affairs officer sort of remit, it's really, unique to identify the person who is expert in all of those verticals. And so somebody who has integrated leadership approach and mindset. I think in 10 years, there will be more talent that has developed with an integrated corporate affairs skill set. But right now, typically, even when there's a structural decision to integrate those functions, the hiring team is indexing in one direction or another and picking a first chair skill set that leads the function.
That's really interesting. I mean, you've highlighted so many interesting skills areas that are sort of in evolution or even in flux. I mean, you obviously talked about the need for a business first person, but at the same time, people saying they really need some of the traditional skills around writing, employee comms becoming increasingly important, obviously crisis and issues management. And you talked a bit, earlier about AI. And I know it's hard to answer because it's all so much in flux, but, how do you see that playing in? For example, writing, I can't help thinking that that's being massively disrupted now by AI. But where do you see that's going in terms of people developing skills?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's already one of the things, again, we hear it from senior hiring managers when they hire their senior person. We also hear it from chief comms and corporate affairs officers when they're struggling to hire junior talent, that writing skills have perhaps suffered or we don't recruit at that level, but that's what we hear from hiring managers that are hiring for those kind of in the first chapter of their career. So I think it's definitely, from the playing with it we've done, you can certainly, AI does a pretty good job, and it's going to take a lot of the friction out of some of the sort of more entry level roles, and I think free up time and space to emphasize more critical thinking. But I also think, one of the things we hear, particularly when it comes to CEO writing and executive communications, there is something to the sort of tonality and getting inside of an executive and business's head that I'm sure AI is getting smarter and smarter, and, you can train it to look pretty good at that. But I still think we're a long ways off from, not needing good human writers in this field.
Yeah, it's a fascinating space and how it's evolving. So, Jessamyn, you talked a bit there about the importance of being a business first CCO, the kind of rising importance of business and financial acumen. And we hear a lot about that. I'm always kind of just interested in, what would your take be on what that means in practice? I mean, is that, obviously understanding sort of strategy, operations? Is it kind of specifically about financial skills? I mean, for example, I know there are a few financial comms agencies that, require their people to be trained, in FINRA or CFA or, there's not many, but there are some. Is it that kind of stuff? Is it kind of specific to specific kind of business financial skills? Is it a broader piece, business judgment? Is it a bit of both? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's all a bit of all of the above, but I think at a basic level, you can't lose sight of sort of the fundamental, like, how does your organization make money? How does it make money and how does it spend money? And I think, that should always be sort of somewhere in the ecosystem of your sort of framing your thinking, because that's, bluntly what a lot of the decision makers at an organization sort of care most about. And so I think your communications, if your sort of strategy and recommendations and tactics kind of are rooted in that, it's pretty hard to build or maintain credibility. And then I think over time, you accrue the credibility and sort of business judgment to know when to throw that out the window and not sort of, that doesn't need, you sort of have the trust of leaders enough to, and you know enough about the business to throw that out in the moments that it might make most sense to do so. But if it doesn't start there, I think it's pretty hard.
And you mentioned, obviously credibility, ability to influence, and also knowing enough about the business. I mean, we have this kind of perennial conversation, I guess, about to what extent comms people should be sector agnostic, to what extent is it better to be specialists? I mean, do you see any trends there or any benefits of being one or the other as one develops one's career?
My personal bias is that it's best to be a utility player and a best athlete. And I believe we can measure one's success most by how they've been able to port or not their experience across industries or sectors. That said, certain industries tend to kind of keep within themselves, particularly regulated industries. I would say we see it harder to sort of translate experience from one to another or from non-regulated to regulated industries, and sometimes hiring teams don't believe the same sort of, philosophy that I do. But in general, I think broader is better.
That's really interesting. I know that kind of demarcation of the regulated versus non-regulated is very important. And I can't help thinking also, given how much industries are in flux now in terms of convergence, especially because of tech. So you have fintech, obviously financial services and technology coming together, or health tech. Then maybe that kind of sort of behooves comms people to kind of be able to be a bit more flexible. But it's really interesting to hear your perspective about that. And just kind of thinking about sort of going forward, we're in such a time of flux for many reasons. But what makes you hopeful about the current and next generation of communications leaders? And what advice would you give them as they develop their careers?
Well, I mean, I think there's so much promise and opportunity for the next generation of leaders in this function. I mean, if I think about the 20 years I've spent recruiting in this function and how much the roles, responsibilities, credibility of this function and these roles have evolved, I think that's evolving faster and in a more accelerated way. I think there are more innovative tools to use. I think there's more built-in sort of trust and credibility for the function at senior levels and even board levels than, if you rewind the clock 10 and plus years ago. So I think there's tremendous opportunity within this function, and the next generation of leaders is going to help us navigate a whole new set of issues with new channels that haven't even been developed yet. So my advice, I think, is to just, expose yourself to as many sort of new and different business and audience and messaging environments and challenges as you can, particularly early on in your career. There may come a time where you need to make choices to specialize in a particular part of the function or industry. But I think particularly in the first half of your career, learning from diverse business and functional leaders is the best kind of practical business school for what's to come.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, the kind of concept of the sort of practical business school, first half of your career, getting as much exposure as you can to the profession. And I'm just wondering, like in the context of return to the office versus remote versus hybrid, what are your thoughts about the kind of optimal environment, for early stage professionals to be in, to be able to develop and to be able to expose themselves to different innovative areas?
I think you need to be in the office or with the leaders more than not. So I think I would say in general, the pendulum has definitely swung at a leadership level. Most of our clients are wanting their executive level roles in the office, if not full-time, most of the time. And I think so much of this function in earlier stage is learned by listening and observing and being part of the meeting, even before you have sort of an active or leadership role in it. And I don't think you'll have those opportunities if you're not there.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly pros and cons, but I guess one factor on the side of the kind of being in the office piece is that kind of apprenticeship type engagement, that's one thing that's very easy in the office. But yes, I know it's a hot button subject, and also in flux. But Jessamyn, that's been a really fascinating conversation. Before we let you go, I'll ask you one last question that we ask all our guests on this podcast. What gets you up in the morning?
Well, right now it's my 10-month-old daughter. But beyond that, and probably more what you're asking, I have so much optimism for the continued evolution and value of the roles we recruit for. And, what we hear every day from our clients is a new level of commitment. With that comes a new level of pressure. But I think, even more opportunity for these communications leaders to make an impact.
Jessamyn, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been great speaking to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to PodCatalyst, the official podcast of IABC. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Have a suggestion for a future episode? Send us a note at catalyst@iabc.com. To discover all IABC has to offer, visit our website at iabc.com. Until next time.